Okay, we get started there. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Just to confirm, we're on level 4 and you're here to hear about the trends in executive remuneration. So if you wanted to go upstairs for the ESG one, tough luck. You've missed the boat and you're stuck with us now. So I'm joined here by a colleague, a panel of esteemed colleagues who are going to be talking about the trends that are going forward in executive remuneration at the moment. In a moment, everybody will introduce themselves directly, but for those of you who I haven't met before, I'm Ian Cox. I run the Share Plans business here at EQ in Europe. We're going to be discussing today quite a few topics, as you can see there. So reflections of the last 12 months, what's making the UK more competitive, design and the implementation of share plans, the role of the Remuneration Committee at the moment, and then more importantly, some questions from you, everybody who's in front of us. So let's get straight into the session. We're not going to go into the questions. Straight into the session and let everybody introduce themselves. So to my left, Susanna.
Hello, I'm Susanna Crooks. I'm a legal director at Tapestry Compliance. For those of you who don't know me or don't know Tapestry, Tapestry is a specialist law firm. We focus on executive and employee share plans. We provide legal advisory services, as you might expect from a law firm, but we also provide our database on tap, which has legal and tax compliance information on launching your share plans globally. Personally, I'm also quite involved in the training that we run, both with the CGI in the Certificate of Employee Share Plans and our own training arrangements.
Hi, I'm Katie Kenny. I'm a partner in the Deloitte Executive Compensation Consulting practice. So I spend my days advising remuneration committees on design, implementation and governance of senior executive pay arrangements. Deloitte are the largest practice in the market, so we advise around a third of the FTSE 350. So we've got our finger on the pulse of all things changing in terms of executive pay.
Hi, I'm Anna Watch. I'm a senior manager in the corporate governance team at BT. We sit within the COSEC area. I support BT's Remuneration Committee and Deloitte are BT's REM advisors. And I'm also responsible for BT's all employee and executive share plans.
Hi, excuse me. I'm Andrew Ninian. I'm Director of Stewardship, Risk and Tax at the Investment Association. The Investment Association is the trade body for UK-based asset managers. We have about 250 members who manage about 8.8 trillion worth of assets for clients both in the UK and overseas. And I suppose for this discussion, our members own about a third of the typical UK listed company.
Super, thank you. So I suppose it would be really great to start off the session. Andrew, what are your reflections on the last 12 months?
I think one of the overriding reflections is how quiet it was. I think if you'd asked us this time last year how we were thinking about the forthcoming AGM season, we were quite worried that actually we're going through a cost of living crisis. There was concern actually for the reputation of UK PLC, for shareholders, about actually how we would manage through it. And I think looking back, everyone is pretty pleased, relaxed, comfortable with how the AGM season went. And I think one of the main things around that was actually investors and companies were quite aligned as to what they were asking for. So there was a big focus from investors around the cost of living and particularly what Remcos were looking at when they were coming to executive salary increases, but also putting remuneration outcomes in the context of wider stakeholder experience. So telling us what you were doing for all employees, as well as what you were doing for executives. And I think that led to a much quieter AGM season than there could have been. And I think one of the main reasons was that alignment point, that actually when we were talking to companies this time last year, companies were thinking about what they were going to do for their executives, but they were also thinking what they were doing for their employees. And they recognized that actually there was constrained budgets and they needed to focus budgets on lowest paid employees. And many had already made allowances or one-off payments to lowest paid employees to recognize what was going on with the cost of living crisis. So naturally, when investors came out and said, we want see some restraint, we want actually for companies to explain why they're paying their executives what they're paying, and actually executive salary increases to be lower than the workforce, there was broad agreement. So it led to a quieter, more positive AGM season than there could have been.
And Katie, from your perspective?
I think over the last 12 months, there's been an increased sense of perhaps optimism around kind of what the future of executive pay might look like. If I think back, we've seen a couple of examples where there's been increased flexibility around what companies can do. A couple of companies where they've scaled back their bonus deferral, for example, where shareholding guidelines have been met, and a couple of companies that have done quite radical changes that have ultimately been supported by shareholders because of the credibility of their argument. In this case, the need to recruit and retain talent in the US. And I think the kind of, Big Tent conversation as a shorthand for the conversation around the role of pay and the impact of UK competitiveness, I think companies and investors are starting to sort of think more broadly around what the future might look like. And I'm quietly optimistic about the areas that might change.
And Susanna, from your perspective as well.
I'd like to echo a bit of that optimism. I think a bit of optimism is always a good thing. And I think what we've certainly seen from our clients and our practice is along the lines that Andrew's outlined. It was maybe a little bit of a year of the swan in some ways. So things have sailed by quite sort of peacefully and making quite steady progress. But I think there has been a certain amount of paddling under the water, and it has been that thinking through the detail. So we didn't have major changes in the Investment Association principles and guidelines, for example, last year. So a lot of things stayed the same. But what was really important was within existing frameworks to get the detail right, to get the quantum right, to get the strategy around targets and performance measurement right, so that we did get that alignment and a building sense of engagement and trust actually between executives, between management teams and between their investors to lead through to that optimism. So I think a quiet year, but I think quite an interesting year in terms of all the things that were going on behind the scenes to deal with cost of living, to make sure that windfall gains were managed in the way that was expected. I think that's all contributed to that sort of quieter picture. So a swan is my summary.
Swan. And Anna, everyone's probably really interested in your opinions from the issuer perspective as well.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say BT is a swan. I don't quite know what animal I would have it as right at this moment in time. And I think it feels like we're sort of starting to return to the new normal, as I would say it is. We at BT certainly mindful of, and you would have seen it in the press, we had some industrial action last year over pay, which we really wanted to try and avoid. We had done a certain amount in terms of a pay increase for our lower paid employees that they weren't happy with, if I'm honest. So then we had to sort of revisit it, look at then what we could do for our lower paid employees. And by lower paid, I mean those earning £50,000 or less, particularly in the UK. And then in January this year, did a £1,500 consolidated pay increase. That has since been followed up with a further pay increase in September, both at the management level and at that sort of lower paid employee level. So across the piece, not throwing statistics and figures out at you, I think at a management level, we've seen an average of 5.5% pay increase. For those lower paid employees, it's roughly 5.5%, but on an average, up to 6.5%. But there is some discretion as well at that lower level for us to give individuals a higher pay increase. And that has been well received. I think the difficulty is it doesn't matter how much you give people, they always want more. But you have to then try and manage that and plan it over the year ahead. I think for us, in terms of the AGM season, in common with a lot of other companies, we put our policy up for review this year. That was well supported by shareholders. So I think, a quieter year probably than a lot had anticipated. But then what does that mean for the year ahead?
It's almost like we planned this, and it's a great segue to the next section. I think it would be really interesting, Katie, from your perspective. We spoke about it earlier on with the London Stock Exchanges. How do we make the UK more competitive? Would it help to re-examine remuneration policies? How do we change the restrictions that are placed upon employees and directors alike?
Yeah. So I guess I'd open by a remark saying that, I will obviously be answering from a pay perspective because that is my area of expertise. But pay is obviously only one small part of how we made the UK more competitive, and there's other areas that we need to look at as well. The other thing I would say is that there is a lot that works with the current system. And it's critically important that with whatever we change and whatever we move to, we keep some of those fundamentals that are so important to ensuring that executive pay creates long-term alignment with the shareholder experience and makes sure that executives are incentivized to make those long-term sustainable decisions for companies, but also for pension holders and all those investors that are relying on that company valuation into the future. But what I would say is, I think from a pay perspective, having more flexibility within the system to recognize that companies are very different and they sometimes need different things to enable them to recruit and retain talent and to motivate talent. For example, large businesses that genuinely compete for talent internationally, maybe they do need higher quantum, maybe they do need to use hybrid plans so they can compete more readily with the US market. Perhaps retail businesses don't need 3-year performance cycles. Perhaps they would be better off having 2-year or even more, annual bonus style performance cycles, recognizing the period of time over which they manage their business. So just a little bit more flexibility within the overall framework. And I think in particular in relation to some of those shareholding features, I think having more flexibility there, with the focus being on the outcome of creating an environment where executives hold a lot of shares and are aligned with the shareholders in and for a period post-employment, rather than it being built up on a series of rules where you have to have bonus deferral, you have to have a holding period, you have to have shareholding guidelines, you have to have post-employment shareholding guidelines of a specific length for a specific period of time, and just maybe taking a more holistic outcomes-based approach to how pay is structured.
And Susanna, what are you seeing from your clients' perspectives?
I think we are still in an environment where there's, we've still got a long way to go before there is sort of trust in the system around pay being set to ensure you've got the right people in the right places, driving that growth, driving that productivity. So we're going to expect still quite a lot of scrutiny around executive pay in particular. I think the important thing with that scrutiny is, similar to Katie was saying, we don't focus too much on rules and regulations and restrictions and get bound up in all of that at the expense of that bigger picture, which is how do you create alignment with stakeholders, alignment with investors specifically, alignment with business strategy. And you need to have the space within the framework that we have to take a step back and think a little bit broader and think a bit sort of bigger picture. We do have the corporate governance code, which is to be applied on a comply or explain basis. And so that's a really good starting point. There is some flexibility already within that. And I think we need to be sure that we can really hang on to that and not lose it in a wealth of over scrutiny and additional regulation.
And Andrew, from an investment association perspective, obviously you want to see good governance, you want to see performance metrics being applied, but what's your opinion on this matter?
So I think to reiterate a point that Katie made is that actually we want a competitive UK market. We want more companies to list in the UK. And there are many, many issues and things that are being aired over the last couple of years, and executive pay is one of them. But we need to look at them as a whole, and we can't just pinpoint areas. In terms of the executive remuneration debate, we want the best people to run businesses and to create long-term value for shareholders and ultimate beneficiaries. I think we would point to a couple of issues that we think need to be put on the table as part of this debate. The first is, this is not just about companies and their shareholders. This is about the people's money we're actually managing. And for a number of asset owners, so pension funds, executive remuneration along with ESG is one of the most important issues. It's one of the issues that they talk to their asset managers most about, and that they will judge the quality of the job they're doing by how they are voting at company AGMs on executive remuneration. And last couple of weeks, there has been a group of asset owners coming out and talking about a fair remuneration framework. So we need to have that asset owner context, the people's money that is being managed in the debate as well. We also need the political context. The UK government has been clear over many years that shareholders have a role in policing executive pay. They've given shareholders more disclosures and more votes over the years, with a clear mandate that it is shareholders' responsibility. So there needs to be a bit of a wider debate around actually what do politicians want from executive pay, and are we happy with the direction of travel? And then the third piece is the regulatory environment, that actually after each corporate failure, there has been more and more added to the corporate governance code, or either implicitly or explicitly, which is added to the complexity and reduced the perceived value of remuneration that an executive get. And I think we need to have an honest conversation about those things that have been added. Have they worked? And in totality, has it led to the right outcomes, or has it just meant to a perceived lowering of remuneration? And I think that leads on to the final point that I would make is we need to understand what the problem is as well. Different people are analysing different problems. And I think there are three broad buckets. One is pure quantum. Can we compete with the US? And then there's a question, is the US the right geography to compete with? The second one is what is the right structure, and should we go for more hybrids, or is the restricted share and LTIP model too restrictive? And the third one is this incrementalism of things we've added to the code to protect companies, society, and investors from short-term behaviours. Is that really working? So I think from the investor side, we want to have the conversation. We want to come to the right outcomes, but it needs to be a fully informed conversation, bringing all the stakeholders and all the issues onto the table to have a really rounded debate as to what we all want going forward.
I think that's really well summarised in those three buckets. And just to pick up on your point around the US, I think from my perspective, the debate is overly focused on the comparison between the UK and the US. If you look at pay levels generally, it's actually not the UK that's the outlier, it's the US, with paying significant multiples of what a lot of other countries pay. And I think we also need to think about what we want to stand for as a society. Do we want to be the kind of society where we care about whether workers are well paid throughout the value chain, or do we care less about that? And I think that in Britain, we all do care about those kind of things. And I think we need to think more broadly about that. So I do think that interplay between the UK and the US there's too much focus on that in the debate at the moment, I think.
They are different markets as well.
Yes.
They've got different governance regimes, risk profiles from an executive perspective, but also from an investor.
And they're much richer than us.
And so, Annie, you've had a practical example of this year at BT. So
We have. So, yes, we've announced a new female chief executive who'll be joining us, or she's already a non-executive director at BT, Alison Kirkby. She's currently CEO of Telia in Sweden. And she'll be joining us in January when Philip Jansen, our existing CEO, steps down. And Philip joined us in 2019, and at that time, I think we'd had quite a turbulent experience with our previous CEO. So Remco were very, cognizant at the time of trying to set the right tone. So when Philip joined, his pay was fixed for 5 years. And Alison, our new CEO, will come in on the same level of pay as Philip, with the same benefits, all of which is within our existing REM policy. And I think it's that alignment and not seeing that, you've got to go above market or do something that you think is slightly different because you're bringing somebody new in. And I think Remco are definitely, and Katie, you will attest to this as well, in terms of the discussions that they had around the package, ensuring that there is still that sort of shareholding requirement in there, which at CEO level is 500% of salary. That is still ensuring that shareholder alignment that is so critical. The pension provision, again, 10% is in line with our wider workforce as well. And in terms of the bonus, the on-target bonus and the maximum bonus, it's still that same quantum ultimately. Obviously, bonus outcomes are dependent on performance of the company. But again, Remco has that discretion to look at it at the end of the 3-year period before then deciding what they want to do. And I think that's a really critical, it's not just to the external market, but it's internally as well. Our employee, we have a 100K employee base, and they are really, really focused on this sort of thing. It means a lot to them currently our chief exec, Philip, he holds sort of employee engagement sessions every couple of months. They're always pushing him about his pay, what they see in the market. And he's always really open about it and says, look, I don't set my own pay. Remco set my pay. But obviously Remco have to operate within their parameters as well.
It's certainly interesting. So we've referenced America, we've referenced other jurisdictions. So I think it's really interesting now to explore what type of executive share plans are being used at the moment. How do they compare with other jurisdictions? And what should we be looking at? So, Susanna, what do you think from your perspective?
So I think executive share plans, so at director level, board level, UK listed companies principally still got a fairly traditional approach to a long-term incentive and then a deferred bonus arrangement when we're talking about sort of equity plans. I think the structure of the LTIP may be evolving a little bit, but it's step by step. Obviously, if you're in a company who's made a big change, it's not step by step for you. But I think across the piece, it is step by step. I think we've got more than 3/4 of FTSE 100 companies still with some form of performance share for their LTIP. So some sort of to acquire shares for no cost based on achievement of stretching performance conditions. So I think that's largely where we still are. I think the step-by-step change is a little bit more conversation around the move to a hybrid plan or restricted share plan. So the restricted share plan being something where you possibly have a reduction in quantum of sort of maximum award outcome, but you have more of a performance underpin rather than a stretching performance target. We've had a number of conversations with our clients over the last 12 months about that type of plan, and they're coming at it from a number of different positions. I think the key driver is to achieve a better sort of alignment, but the reasons behind why they think that would be a better alignment do vary slightly. So one of the situations is where they've had a run of performance share awards that haven't vested. So in terms of giving executives alignment with investors, with shareholders, in terms of being shareholders themselves and building that shareholding, they're not achieving that because the LTIP awards aren't vesting. So that source of shares into the shareholding pot is no longer there. And it's perceived that perhaps with the restricted share plan, the vesting profile is a little less volatile and it's a little easier to predict how that's going to go over time. So seeing a bit of a move to that, as I say, for a variety of reasons. Still a certain amount of nervousness making that big step for companies that have worked with the sort of traditional PSP model for a long time. I think they're concerned to make sure it lands well with their investors, and obviously it needs to be properly explained. There needs to be justification for doing it. They're concerned how it also will land with management in some cases, and I think there is a view that a lot of executive boards will back themselves to do well and to meet those stretching performance targets, and therefore they perhaps prefer the higher available quantum and to be driven to achieve that performance. So there's still a little bit of a nervousness about that, but we are seeing a sort of steady churn of conversations about that move to the restricted share plan. And then in terms of that sort of comparison with what we're seeing in other jurisdictions, again, there's often a lot of focus on what you see in the US. And I think we still don't have as many cases in the UK of a sort of combined approach of different award types. So combining performance shares and restricted shares and possibly some market value options as well to not make sure that you get something one way or other, but actually to balance the different behaviours and the different motivations that those different award types are driving, and not to put all your eggs in one basket, but to try and get that more sort of holistic approach. That's something that I think we still see less of here in the UK.
It's an interesting point about the blended approach and minimum shareholding requirements and that sort of thing. So, for Anna, from a BT perspective, is there practical implementation changes?
So we moved to a restricted share plan in 2020, having had a traditional performance-based plan with TSR, free cash flow and revenue as our targets. in doing so, it also meant that the level of grant was lower because you've got more certainty at the end of that period in terms of, we didn't put performance measures in. We've got underpins. The underpins are reviewed each year in terms of the plan as well. But it just gave people that little bit more certainty. To your point, Susanna, around, we'd called it a drought in terms of, no vesting, which when you're trying to incentivise and motivate, yes, your senior management team, but also all of those that are supporting the company to deliver, it's really quite disheartening when, year on year, you're not seeing anything coming through. Whereas now, this year, as I say, we introduced the RSP in 2020. It was the first vest this year in June. People were delighted, that they could then, and I say that across the piece at our more senior level, they have a further holding period up until year 5 before they can do anything with the shares, which is good because that's still keeping their commitment there. In terms of windfall gains, I know we've touched on it very slightly. I mean, for us, it wasn't, Remco considered it, but given what our grant price was and the vesting price, there was probably only about a 20 pence difference, which is unfortunate, but, it's still a slight difference. And by difference, I mean slightly higher share price, not lower. But I think it's still key things for committees and for the company to consider in terms of what it wants to do going forward. We still operate the deferred bonus plan, but at lower levels, we're then sort of removing some of that deferral requirement. So it really is then targeted more at that much senior management level to continue with that engagement.
Katie, from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd echo Susanna's comments around sort of what we see in terms of common practice. So most companies still operating a performance share plan, minority around 10% of the market now offering a restricted share plan in the same way that Anna does at BT. But I think there would be a lot of interest in companies moving towards a more hybrid structure, so balancing a performance-based share plans and an RSP, if there was support from investors on that. And we know, Andrew can probably talk to this more eloquently than I can because he'll be on the sharp end of seeing a lot of those consultations. But we know from what we hear in the market that lots of companies have gone out and asked for that and just don't feel like they're in a position to get a strong enough level of shareholder support to proceed with that. But if there was a bit of a shift in tone, I think that'd be something that a lot of companies would be interested in trying to have a system which strikes that balance between having some upside leverage while having some level of certainty for executives. Now, I'm in two camps on this personally. I see why you might want to do that, but I also see, what I'm sure Andrew will articulate, that sort of it is a little bit having your cake and eating it. Some of the other interesting things that I've been seeing companies having conversations on is perhaps rebalancing between long-term and short-term a little bit. So moving perhaps more into the bonus with extended deferral and having a smaller LTIP awards. So if you're in a business that has quite short business cycles, so there's a lot of uncertainty over the longer term, having something which is more focused on delivery within the near term that you have more line of sight to might be something that is more motivational for executives. But you do obviously still need to have that counterbalance with the extended deferral to make sure that you are not encouraging short-term decision making. So I think that's quite interesting. And I also think the idea raised by the Purposeful Company, I don't know what, 4 or 5 years ago now, around having an RSP as a sort of a basis, but perhaps having an opportunity to have a multiplier on that based on performance, again, trying to strike that balance between some leverage, but with some level of certainty. I think that's an interesting concept as well. We've not seen that yet so far.
Now, it's interesting. So from an administration perspective this year, we've seen a lot of companies where the underlying performance of the company hasn't been that bad, but performance metrics haven't triggered because of some of the world events that we've seen. So it is certainly affecting individuals directly, which is not necessarily the result of the company. So Andrew, from an investment association, how do you think about everything that's been said?
Good question.
No.
So I think there's a lot going on here and sort of understanding the journey that we are on. So there are a range of views. So with investors, there are a range of views. There is not one view. And actually, it takes time for people to reflect on their view, reflect on what they see with certain companies operating different systems, different approaches, and actually you get the best response out of an investor when one of their portfolio companies actually comes to them with a solid proposal. And often you see them change their mind or think about it in a slightly different way when they see something on paper for a company that they know really well. But generally, there are a group of investors that fundamentally think that actually we need to deliver long-term returns for our beneficiaries. So we need companies to be motivated and incentivized to deliver long-term returns. So there needs to be a performance element of it. Others, for various reasons, think that there's too much complexity in the performance share plan and have been very open, or too much leverage in performance share plan and have been open to restricted shares, particularly in certain companies with a set business model or a set business cycle. I think the main reason why hybrids haven't really picked off with investors is probably two. One, coming back to complexity, are you doing more of the other? And actually, what is one of the key drivers for moving to restricted shares, and for companies to explain that to their shareholders, was the strategic rationale. And as soon as you bring the two together, and actually Weir tried it first before going purely restricted shares, was that strategic rationale sort of weakens if you have a hybrid model. So I think, I don't know whether anyone will be brave enough to come forward with one which actually puts it on the table for investors to consider, rather, because it's very easy for investors to say theoretically no to hybrids, but actually when there is an individual company that has a set proposal, they might think differently. But it is something being considered. But I suppose, again, we need to see the full picture, not just that debate around, is it restricted shares, PSPs, or a hybrid?
I think the difficulty as well is not just in explaining it to your external audience, it's your internal audience as well. And you go, like from us, we've gone from an ISP to an RSP, we've got DBP. People just don't, in the general, they don't understand what all of these plans mean. It's essentially, what am I getting and when am I getting it, which is the internal answer question.
And some of the issue is actually a number of companies that have moved to restricted shares have moved back to performance share plan. There has been quite a shift back for various reasons. And that doesn't help the case for restricted shares with investors if companies are moving back quite quickly. It may promote the case for hybrid to having a bit of both, but actually that movement to one scheme and then back is not entirely helpful because it doesn't look like a long-term remuneration strategy.
RSPs for Christmas.
I'm still waiting for the advisor community to come back with a costed option back what we had 15, 20 years ago. So I've got this great new plan. Perhaps we should do a costed option.
There are many consultants that come up with them.
So I think, look, moving on from there, Anna, I think we've heard some great opinions there, and it's where do you think the current role of the Remuneration Committee is in all of this, and do you foresee any changes for 2024?
I think it's actually very topical because we've just changed Remco chair this year as well, and I think it's really interesting to see the dynamics change around the table when you get a new Remco chair come in. And then look, and she's very experienced. For those of you who don't know, we've got Ruth Kearney, she joined just in April as our senior independent director and is also our Remco chair, and is clearly a very experienced, specifically in that area. I think the difficulty is with sort of the proposed code changes that are coming in. We still don't know what's in, what's out. There's a lot of rumours on the street as to what is going to be in there. But I still think the fundamentals of a Remco, they don't really change over time. They've still got to consider that wider workforce. They still have to consider the external perception. They've still got to consider, incentivising those, the employees, but also looking at that succession pipeline as well. Because if you can't incentivise those sorts of people internally, what sort of organisation will you end up with, ultimately? And it's interesting, I think, just recently, you look at, or even throughout the AGM season, is you just get snippets in the press of, this REM policy has been voted down, or, they're not happy. The water companies have taken an absolute hounding this year, haven't they? And everybody is trying to do what they think is the right thing. And it is difficult sometimes, you try and engage with some of the agencies. Some will just give you a blanket, no, we're not engaging. Others will say, well, we think this, and this, which isn't actually what you were asking them in the first place anyway. So then, and I'm not suggesting that. But I think it's hard, I think I personally would always go into this sort of the AGM voting season thinking we're going to get a hard time. And if we don't, you come out of it and think, oh, okay, that's okay. We got a 98% vote in favour for both our policy and our REM report this year. And you just never know sometimes what you're going to get. I mean, for us, obviously, we have a very large shareholder who holds 24.5% of our stock, another one who holds just over 12. So you sort of, you don't discount them because you want to get them across the line as quickly as you can. But at the same time, just a small vote against can put you on the naughty step, and I don't think anybody wants.
Perhaps you should have been more aggressive in your remuneration policies.
No thanks.
Katie.
I think for me, the one area I think is sometimes a little bit inconsistent within the remuneration committees that I sit in, and I would like to see more of, is Remco's sort of really taking that step back when they're assessing bonus and LTIP outcomes and thinking about kind of performance and the shareholder and the stakeholder experience more generally. So good remuneration committees will look at a dashboard of broader information at that point in time. So they will understand kind of like contextually how things will fit. And 9.5 times out of 10, they're not making any changes off the back of that. But I just think the rigor of going through that step and going through that piece of information, I just think is really important. And I think it can not doing it can open yourself up to the kind of mistakes that you're perhaps worried about, that, that you can sometimes then end up in a problem that you didn't really know about. And the other area I think you touched on already, Anna, was around that kind of role of the wider workforce. And I think it's becoming more and more important that decisions that are made around executive pay are explainable in the context of what we've done. Not just explainable, but that sit fairly and feel comfortable in the context of what you're doing for everyone else. That doesn't have to be exactly the same because they are different groups of people, and sometimes you need to make different decisions for those, but that you go into that with your eyes open as a remuneration committee. So having that knowledge and having that experience, I think, is just really important. So those would be my two areas that I'd like to see remuneration committees look at more.
Do you think, Katie, that there is, and I'm not suggesting BT did this, but there are instances where REMCOs are protected from, or information is withheld from them, if you like, in terms of that wider workforce and the culture / temperature within the company of the wider workforce? Do you see?
I wouldn't like to say withheld, but I don't think sometimes they always have their finger fully on that pulse because, why would they? Then naturally the job is to do that. But so I think sometimes I can imagine if they knew slightly different things, they might just take a different tone on some of the debates.
Okay.
I'd never like to think that people purposely withhold information.
Susanna, I mean, have you seen anybody withholding information?
I haven't actually seen the withholding of information as such, but I think it's a difficult balance to strike. And I think it is something that we are aware that companies are thinking about is how to make sure that when Remco is thinking about exec pay in the context of the wider workforce pay, that they have the relevant information in front of them and have enough of a finger on the pulse without being distracted by a lot of noise that is going to hinder decision making and sort of clear line of sight. So I think it is a really interesting balance. I think the sort of remit of the Remco, as I think you said, Anna, is sort of, in some ways it is where it's always been, but I think within that you are getting increasing focus on discretion. We are seeing a lot of companies write a bit more discretion into their share plan rules, for example, so that they can address those bigger picture vesting outcomes and have a bit of discretion around that as just one example. And whilst that helps the company, future-proof the legal documentation of the plan, but also operate the plan in a way that is fit for purpose in an unpredictable environment. So it's helpful in that way, but it also puts a lot more onus on the Remco to consider those discretions properly and fairly and in full knowledge of all the relevant facts. So I think it becomes a progressively harder job.
I think we've got to recognise that being on the Remco is a pretty hard job. It is very hard to keep, well, it's impossible to keep everyone happy. They're in the middle of execs, often the chair, shareholders and other stakeholders. And it's a very delicate balance. And there's a lot of emotion involved in the decisions they're taking. And often they don't get credit for some of the decisions they take. I think from an investor perspective, one of the things that we always want is to understand what they've thought about and how they've come to the decision. Often we just get the decision and we don't get the wider context of what else did they think about and how did they get to that decision. That helps investors go through the thinking with them and is more likely to mean that they are supportive because they see it's a thought out process that has come to a fully informed outcome rather than be over reliant on some advice or take a decision on a whim. So actually for us, one of the most important bits of the annual report or the REM report is the letter from Remco chairs, really articulating what are the things we thought about and why have we ended up where we have today, either to use discretion or not to use discretion, but just that thought process coming through and linking it back to the strategy and wider performance of the company is really important.
So that's come to the end of our pre-planned questions answer session. We'd really like to hear from the floor. If there's anybody who's got a question for the panel, we've got a mic coming around the floor. So have we got any questions from the floor? There's got to be one somewhere.
Andrew, you made a really interesting point just then around reporting. What's the panel's viewpoint on integrated reporting? So we've just been through a whole load of new consultations around governance reform. I would echo that some of the comments around the Remco, the onerous duty of a non-executive director on a Remco could also be argued for audit committee or risk committees. We haven't seen any increase in NED fees. I know this is an executive remuneration session, but how do you feel about less disclosure in annual reports and more integrated reporting throughout the year rather than that one moment point in time?
Yeah, so our starting point is we have been very supportive of ISSB, so the International Sustainability Standards Board, and we are supportive of their adoption and endorsement in the UK. We take that position for two reasons. One, we think that will give the investors they need to make long-term decisions around long-term prospects of your company, and incorporating sustainability issues is really important. Secondly, we think it will be helpful for companies who are getting numerous requests for information on different sustainability issues. I think alongside that, the question then is what happens to the rest of non-financial reporting? And obviously we had the call for evidence over the summer. At times it feels a little bit disjointed with ISSB, but our main message there is whatever you put into ISSB, the non-financial reporting alongside it needs to complement it and give the coherent message to come to investors around what is the company strategy, how do you make money, and what the risks to it, and what are the governance to meet that. I think there is a wider debate in the UK Corporate Governance Code, and the competitiveness environment has been really focused on this, is what is the right governance for UK companies now. And we are very supportive of Comply or Explain. We want companies to choose the governance structure which is right for their business strategy and their board, and explain why it is right. So I think we still see value in the annual report because actually it's a document of record, but actually a more informative annual report that looks at the long-term risks to the company and then lying that into governance and remuneration, actually how those things being remunerated. So there's a clearer link between these are sustainability risks and this is how we're remunerating our executives for managing and creating value aligned with those risks. Just on NED fees, we have been supportive and recognise that NED fees haven't kept up with their responsibilities, and that there should be an honest conversation around the time commitments that NEDs are putting in and what they're bringing to the board, and remunerating them appropriately for that time and experience that they would bring.
So I'm being told to wrap things up. So if there are any further questions for the panel, please do try and find them when we've got the networking sessions later on. Just to confirm what's going to be happening next is thank you to our panel for joining me today on stage. I hope you've all found that informative. The next sessions on this floor, we are going to have the Are You Ready? Hot topics for issuers with all employee tax advantage share plans. And upstairs, there will be a drive to digital, particularly focusing on share registration. So if you can decide where you want to go, I'm just waiting for the signal to see if they've finished upstairs so that we don't release and disrupt their session. Are we good to go? We're good to go. So if people would like to go upstairs for the next session, please do. And thank you all for joining us. We appreciate